Hey guys, tonight we are taking a trip back in time. Not to a grand battlefield or a glittering royal court, but to a place far more aromatic. We're heading to the summer of 1858 in London, the heart of the largest empire the world had ever seen. And trust me, you are going to want to hold your nose. This isn't a story of glorious conquest, it's a story of a city so fantastically successful it was literally choking on its own filth. You think your city has problems with trash collection? Oh, you sweet summer child. You probably wouldn't survive the first day's walk to the market. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support means the world, and while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from, and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing on a busy London street corner. It's the mid-19th century. Look around you. The city is a marvel, a true testament to human ambition. Grand, sustained buildings of Portland stone stretch towards a sky often hazy with coal smoke. The air is filled with a cacophony of sounds, the rhythmic clatter of thousands of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the rumble of iron-rimmed carriage wheels, the shouts of street vendors hawking everything from meat pies to miracle elixirs, and the distant, mournful horns of steamships on the Thames. This is the capital of the world, the nexus of global trade, finance, and power. You can feel the energy, the raw, thrumming pulse of progress. But as you take a deep breath to soak it all in, you regret it instantly, because alongside the smell of coal smoke and damp wool is another scent, a complex, layered, and deeply unpleasant bouquet. It's a mix of things you'd rather not identify, the sour tang of unwashed bodies crammed into impossibly tight spaces, the sharp ammonia of horsemen, nor so much horse manure and underneath it all, a faint, sweet, cloying note of decay. It seems to rise from the very stones beneath your feet. You want to cross the street, but it's not as simple as it sounds. The road isn't just paved, it's coated in a thick, greasy sludge of mud, horse droppings, garbage, and whatever else has been tipped out of the windows above. Just as you're contemplating the ruin of your shoes, a small, ragged child darts out from the crowd. He has a crossing sweeper, and for a half-minute, he uses a worn-out broom to clear a narrow path for you through the muck. This is a real, and very necessary, profession. You pay the coin, hurry across the path he has cleared, and try not to think about what's in the muck that's now splattered on your ankles. This is the central paradox of Victorian London. It was a city of staggering wealth and innovation, but it was built on a foundation of medieval infrastructure. In just 50 years, the population had more than doubled, from 1 million to over 2.5 million souls. People were flooding in from the countryside for work in the new factories and workshops. The city was growing at a pace its systems simply couldn't handle. It was the first metropolis of its kind, and it was facing problems on a scale no one had ever imagined. The city that was building the modern world had forgotten to build itself a modern way to go to the bathroom. Now, here's a point that historians still debate: just how much did the average Londoner notice the smell? Was it an ever-present misery? Or had they simply grown accustomed to it? Some argue that their sensory baseline was just completely different from ours. When you're born into a world where the streets are open sewers and the river is thick with waste, perhaps your nose just gives up. Others contend that people were acutely aware and miserable, but felt powerless to change a problem so vast it seemed like a force of nature. They tried to manage it on a personal level. Wealthy ladies carried vinaigretias, little containers of vinegar-soaked sponges, to sniff when the smells became too overpowering, but the idea of fixing the whole city, that seemed impossible. The grime was just a fact of life, like the rain or the fog. For now, you just hold your handkerchief a little closer to your face and try to focus on the grand architecture, ignoring the filth at its feet. But you can feel it. A low-grade hum of disgust underneath. And all of this street-level grime, is just the appetizer. The main course of the problem lies just a few blocks away, in the city's great, glittering, and fatally polluted artery, the River Thames. You walk away from the chaotic street, drawn towards the wide open space of the riverbank. You're expecting a moment of relief, a breath of fresh air, but the smell doesn't get better. It gets worse. It changes. The dry, dusty stink of the street gives way to a wet, heavy, gaseous miasma that seems to cling to the back of your throat. And there it is, the legendary River Thames. From a distance, it might still look majestic. It's broad and powerful, the lifeblood of the empire, carving its path through the heart of London. You can see the grand arches of London Bridge, teeming with traffic, and further down, the skeletal form of the new Palace of Westminster rising, its construction ongoing. But as you get closer, the illusion shatters. The water is not blue or even green. It's a thick, opaque, brownish-grey soup. It moves sluggishly, as if exhausted. You can't see more than an inch below the surface. Floating on top is a grim regatta of city refuse, vegetable peels, rotting scraps from the riverside markets, the bloated carcass of a dog, and patches of a greasy, iridescent film that shimmer with rainbow colors. A circly, gentle wave slaps against the stone embankment, and the smell of raw sewage and decay intensifies with the movement. This river, this open sewer, is also the city's primary source of drinking water. Let that sink in for a moment. The very same body of water that receives the waste from over 2 million people is where a significant portion of those people get the water they use to drink, cook, and wash. Private water companies, driven by profit, had set up intake pipes all along the river. They would draw the water often unfiltered and pump it directly into the homes of their paying customers. And the kicker, many of these intake pipes were situated downstream from where the city's old, overflowing sewers emptied their contents. So you were essentially drinking a diluted version of your neighbor's waste from a few days ago. For the poor who couldn't afford a water company subscription, the process was even more direct. You see a woman, her dress patched and worn, carefully lowering a wooden bucket on a rope into the foul water, trying to find a spot that looks slightly less chunky. It's a grim picture, I know. At low tide, the river reveals another of its secrets. The water recedes, exposing vast, sloping banks of dark, glistening mud, and on this mud, you see hunched figures moving about. These are the toucheurs. They are some of the poorest people in London, and they make a living by scavenging in the filth, armed with long, pointed sticks. They sift through the mud and raw sewage, searching for anything of value that might have been washed away: lost coins, bits of copper, old iron, maybe a piece of dropped jewelry. It was a disgusting, dangerous, but for some, a necessary job. This strange profession highlights a bizarre ecosystem that had developed around the river's pollution. This brings us to a question that historians still grapple with: how could this happen? Did people genuinely not understand that drinking polluted water was making them sick? The answer is complicated. The prevailing scientific theory of the day was the miasma theory. Most doctors and scientists believe that diseases like cholera and typhoid were spread not by germs in the water, but by bad air or foul smells. So, in their minds, the stench itself was the killer. The river was a problem because it stank, not necessarily because people were drinking from it. Of course, many ordinary people, using common sense, suspected the water was to blame. There were countless letters to newspapers and anecdotal reports linking foul water to sickness. Academics still argue over the degree to which ordinary people made the link versus the educated dismissal of such ideas in favor of the miasma theory. It was a tragic disconnect between official science and grim reality. The problem was that the river hadn't always been this bad. For centuries, the Thames had been able to handle London's waste. The natural flow of the water and the sheer volume could dilute and wash away the city's refuse. But something had changed in the last few decades. The population explosion was part of it. But there was another, more direct culprit, a modern, sophisticated invention, designed to improve sanitation and bring cleanliness into the home, was having the catastrophic, unintended consequence of turning the Thames from a merely dirty river into a deadly, bubbling cesspool. It was the technological marvel that would deliver the final, fatal blow to London's already failing system. Let's step away from the foul river for a moment and go inside one of the new, fashionable townhouses being built in areas like Belgravia. You've been invited for tea. The home is a picture of middle-class respectability. There's a piano in the parlor, heavy velvet curtains, and intricate wallpaper. It feels clean, orderly, and, most importantly, it smells relatively fresh inside. And the host is eager to show you their latest and greatest domestic acquisition, a source of immense pride. It's located in a small, private room, often discreetly tucked away. It's a gleaming piece of ceramic and polished wood, the flushing water closet. You look at this device, a marvel of modern plumbing. With a simple pull of a chain, a torrent of clean water rushes into the bowl and whisks everything away, out of sight, out of mind. It's revolutionary. For centuries, dealing with human waste indoors had been a messy, smelly affair involving chamber pots that had to be manually emptied. This new invention promised a new era of domestic hygiene and civility. Londoners who could afford it were installing with gusto. It became a status symbol, a clear line drawn between the modern, clean middle classes and the unwashed masses. But here is the single greatest irony of this whole story. This wonderful invention, this symbol of progress, was the primary culprit in the death of the River Thames. It was the catalyst that turned a chronic problem into an acute, city-ending crisis. How? Because every time someone pulled that chain, all that waste, now mixed with a large volume of water, had to go somewhere, and somewhere was, almost without exception, the nearest sewer. Before the flushing toilet became widespread, London's sewers were primarily designed to do one thing: handle rainwater. They were not built to transport solid human waste. Most household waste went into a cesspit, a brick-lined pit dug in the basement or backyard, which we'll explore in more detail soon. But the water closet bypassed this system entirely. It connected the home directly to the sewer. Suddenly, the old sewers, designed for intermittent rainfall, were being flooded with a constant, daily torrent of raw sewage from tens of thousands of homes. These aging brick tunnels, never intended for such a purpose, quickly became overwhelmed. They would clog, break, unleak. But ultimately, they all had one destination. They all drained directly, and very efficiently, into the River Thames. So every flush of every new toilet was like a small, personal contribution to the poisoning of the city's main artery. The more civilized London became indoors, the more catastrophically foul it became outdoors. It was a perfect, terrible feedback loop. Here's a little known, quirky fact about this transition: the invention of the flushing toilet is often attributed to a man named Thomas Crapper in the late 19th century. But that's mostly a myth, a funny coincidence of his name. The flushing toilet was actually patented much earlier, in 1775 by a watchmaker named Alexander Cumming. But the true popularizer, the man who made it a must-have item for the Victorian middle class, was George Jennings. He installed his monkey closets in the public toilets of the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace. Over 800 Sorrow people paid a penny to use them, and it was a sensation. They were clean, efficient, and odorless. It was brilliant marketing, and it sparked a nationwide craze for indoor plumbing, unwittingly accelerating the pollution of the Thames. The scientific and engineering communities were, of course, aware of what was happening, but their solution was tragically short-sighted. In 1847, responding to public pressure about overflowing cesspits in people's homes, the government passed a law that actually made the problem worse. The law made it mandatory for all new houses to be connected to the sewers and actively encouraged existing homes to connect their cesspits to the sewer system as well. The prevailing logic, driven by the miasma theory, was that it was better to get the smelly waste out of the houses and away from people's noses as quickly as possible. The river seemed like a big, convenient, and free way to do that. The long-term consequences were someone else's problem. Historians are still debating the exact timeline and the key decision-making moments that led to this disastrous policy. Was it a genuine, well-intentioned mistake based on the bad science of the day, or was it a cynical act of kicking the can down the road? Choosing the cheapest and easiest option without regard for the inevitable outcome, the truth is likely a mix of both. The city was in a panic about disease. The miasma theory was dominant, and the engineering challenge of creating a whole new system seemed insurmountable. So they chose the path of least resistance, a decision that would lead directly to the crisis of 1858. Now, let's leave this fancy townhouse and venture into the basement to see the system the flushing toilet was designed to replace. You follow the homeowner down a set of narrow, steep stone steps into the basement. The air immediately grows thick, cool, and damp. It smells of earth, coal dust, and something else, something foul and ancient. This is the underbelly of the respectable London home, the place where the machinery of daily life happens, and in the corner, occupying a significant portion of the cellar space, is the reason for that smell, the suspect. It's essentially a brick-lined tank, a sealed or supposedly sealed chamber built right into the foundations of the house. For generations, this was the standard solution for domestic waste. Every drain in the house, from the kitchen sink to the chamber pots emptied in the morning, led down here. It was a private, self-contained sewer for a single building or a small group of them. In theory, the liquid waste was supposed to seep out gradually into the surrounding soil, while the solid waste accumulated at the bottom. But the reality was far grimmer. These cesspits were oft unpoorly constructed. The brickwork would crack and leak, allowing raw sewage to seep directly into the earth beneath the house. This not only created a permanent, inescapable stench that would rise through the floorboards, but it also contaminated the ground itself. And, crucially, any nearby water wells. Many homes, especially in poorer districts, drew their water from a well in the yard or a communal pump just down the street. They had no idea that the cesspit just a few feet away was slowly poisoning their drinking water. This was the silent, invisible killer in Victorian London. When a cesspit became full, it had to be emptied. And this led to one of the most uniquely disgusting jobs in all of history, the night soil man or nightman. You couldn't just empty a cesspit in the middle of the day. The smell was so monumentally offensive that it was forbidden by law. So this work had to be done under the cover of darkness. A team of night men would arrive with carton buckets, usually after midnight. Their job was to climb down into this pit of human filth, shovel the semi-solid sludge into buckets, and haul it up to be carted away. It was back-breaking, nauseating, and deeply hazardous work. The risk of asphyxiation from the toxic fumes was very real. And where did they take this night soil? Much of it was sold to farmers on the outskirts of London as fertilizer, completing a rather stomach-churning cycle of life. Now for a bizarre little detail about this system. The contents of these cesspits weren't just waste, they were an explosive hazard. The decomposing organic matter produced large quantities of methane and other flammable gases. If an unsuspecting person went into the cellar with a naked flame, like a candle or an oil lamp, the accumulated gas could ignite in a violent explosion, sometimes powerful enough to destroy the entire house. There are documented accounts of homes blowing up because of their overflowing cesspits. So, you weren't just living above a pool of sewage, you were potentially living on top of a ticking time bomb. As you can imagine, having your cesspit emptied was an expensive and unpleasant ordeal, so homeowners would put it off for as long as possible, sometimes for years. This meant that many London homes were sitting on top of vast, ever-growing reservoirs of filth. This is where the flushing toilet and the new laws come back into the picture. The government, rightly concerned about the health hazards of these domestic sewage bombs, ordered them to be phased out. But their solution, connecting them to the sewers, was just moving the problem. Instead of a million little cesspits leaking into the ground, they created one gigantic, river-sized cesspit. This is another point of academic discussion. What was the true scale of the cesspit problem? Historical records are spotty. While official surveys were done, they often missed the thousands of illegal or unrecorded cesspits in the sprawling slums. Some historians argue that the official numbers vastly hid how much waste was being stored directly beneath London's population, making the government's decision to flush it all into the river seem like a desperate, almost panicked reaction to a crisis they could barely comprehend. They were literally trying to clean the slate. But in doing so, they unleashed a monster. The cesspit represented a contained, localized, and hidden form of filth. By flushing it all out into the open, they made the problem visible, unavoidable, and universal. They had taken the private shame of the overflowing cellar and turned it into a very public, city-wide catastrophe. The stage was now set. The city was primed. The river was dying. And all that was needed was the right weather to turn this simmering disaster into a full-blown olfactory apocalypse. Let's pull our focus out from the specifics of toilets and cesspits and look at the bigger picture of what people in 1858 believed about sickness. Imagine you're a doctor, or just a reasonably well-educated Londoner. You see the filth in the streets. You smell the stench from the river. And you know people are dying in huge numbers from diseases like cholera, typhoid, and diphtheria. The question is, why? What is the connection? Your answer, and the answer of almost every respected scientist and public official of the time, would be one word: miasma. The miasma theory. It sounds a bit strange and mystical to us now, but it was the absolute bedrock of medical understanding for most of the 19th century. The theory held that diseases were caused by miasma, the plural of miasma, which were essentially poisonous vapors or mists. These vapors were thought to rise from decaying organic matter, rotting garbage, stagnant water, and of course, human waste. The smell itself was considered the vehicle of the disease. If you could smell it, you could be infected by it. This belief shaped every aspect of life and public health policy. It's why people carried scented handkerchiefs or sniffed vials of vinegar. They believed the pleasant smell would overpower the dangerous one and protect them. It's why wealthier people fled the city for the countryside during the summer, seeking clean air. They weren't just escaping the heat and the inconvenience, they were genuinely fleeing what they believed was a deadly, invisible poison cloud hanging over the city. You see people burning lavender or rosemary in their homes, or even barrels of tar in the streets during an outbreak, all in a desperate attempt to purify the air and drive the miasma away. The miasma theory wasn't entirely crazy. It was based on centuries of observation. People had long noticed that disease was more common in low-lying, swampy, and smelly areas. The correlation was undeniable. Where there was filth and stench, there was sickness. Their only mistake was confusing correlation with causation. They correctly identified the where of the disease but got the how completely wrong. They saw the smoke but missed the fire. The real culprits, the microscopic bacteria and viruses in the contaminated water and food, were completely unknown. Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease was still years away from being developed and accepted. Here's a curious, and rather sad, side effect of the miasma theory. It often had a strong moral and social dimension. Since filth was believed to generate disease, the poor were often blamed for their own sickness. The slums, with their overcrowding and lack of sanitation, were seen not just as unfortunate, but as morally deficient places that actively generated the miasmas that could then drift out and infect the respectable classes. The great and washed were seen as a direct threat. This created a sense of fear and resentment, distracting from the real, systemic failures of infrastructure that affected everyone. There were, however, a few lone voices crying in the wilderness. The most notable was a physician named John Snow. A few years before our story, in 1854, a terrifying cholera outbreak devastated the Soho district of London. While other doctors were talking about miasmas, Snow did something revolutionary. He started mapping the deaths. He went door to door, talked to the families of the victims, and marked each case on a street map. He soon noticed a terrifying cluster of deaths, all centered around a single public water pump on Broad Street, now Broadwick Street. He discovered that a nearby leaky cesspit was contaminating the well water for that specific pump. To prove his theory, he persuaded the local authorities to take the handle off the pump, making it unusable. The outbreak in that area almost immediately stopped. It was a brilliant piece of epidemiological detective work, a landmark in the history of public health. But was he hailed as a hero? Not at all. The medical establishment largely dismissed his findings. They were too invested in the miasma theory. They argued it was a coincidence, or that the bad air must have somehow been concentrated around the pump. The idea of an invisible poison in the water itself seemed far-fetched to them. Academics still debate why snow's clear. Evidence-based work was so thoroughly ignored for so long. Was it pure scientific dogma, professional jealousy, or the fact that accepting his theory would mean admitting the private water companies were selling poison? A politically and economically explosive conclusion, whatever the reason. His work was filed away, and the city continued to operate under the assumption that the smell was the killer. This brings us right to the precipice of our main event. As the 1852 wore on, the Thames became smellier and smellier. And for a city that believed smell was death, this was a terrifying development. The river was no longer just an inconvenience, it was seen as a gigantic miasma-generating machine. A great dragon exhaling a pestilential breath over the entire metropolis. The stage was perfectly set for mass panic. All it needed was a little push from Mother Nature. Let's introduce one of the most brilliant minds of the era into our story. Not a politician, not a doctor, but a man of pure science, Michael Faraday. By the 1852s, Faraday was a national treasure, a living legend. He was the son of a blacksmith who, through sheer genius and hard work, had risen to become one of the world's leading scientists, famous for his groundbreaking discoveries in electromagnetism and chemistry. He was also a man who lived and worked in London, right beside the river at the Royal Institution. And he was not impressed with the state of his city. Imagine it's a hot day in early June of 1855. 3 years before the Great Stink fully hits, Faraday decides to take a steamboat trip on the Thames. Perhaps to escape the heat of his laboratory, or simply to get from one part of the city to another. As the paddle steamer chugs along, he is overcome, not by the beauty of the view, but by the sheer, staggering foulness of the water. He's a chemist. He understands decomposition and chemical reactions. What he sees and smells is not just unpleasant, it's an affront to science and civilization. So he decides to conduct a simple, yet brilliant, experiment. He starts stirring up pieces of white card he has with him. At regular intervals, he drops a piece of card into the river. He watches as, for a moment, the white square is visible in the brown murk, and then, in a matter of seconds, it disappears completely from sight, swallowed by the opaque, polluted water. He does this again and again as the boat moves from London Bridge to Hungerford Bridge. The result is always the same. The river is so thick with suspended matter, as he would call it, that it's practically opaque. Faraday is so appalled by this that he goes home and does something that scientists of his stature rarely did. He writes a furious letter to the editor of the Times, the most influential newspaper in the world. His letter, published on July 7, Yabamu, is a masterpiece of scientific disgust and public shaming. He describes his experiment with the cards in vivid detail. He writes, "The whole of the river was an opaque pale brown fluid. Near the bridges, the FECU lengths rolled up in clouds so dense that they were visible at the surface. The smell was very bad. And come into the hole of water, it was the same as that which now comes up from the gully holes in the streets. The whole river was for the time a real sewer." His letter causes a sensation. When a man like Faraday, a calm, rational scientist known for his precise and unemotional work, uses language like that, people listen. He's not some crackpot or a political agitator. He is the voice of scientific reason. And he is telling the world that the River Thames is an abomination. His letter gives a new legitimacy to the public's complaints. It's one thing for ordinary people to say the river stinks. It's another for Michael Faraday to scientifically document its filth. One of the interesting, less known details of Faraday's involvement is his deep personal connection to the river. He wasn't just a Londoner, he was a Sandemanian, a member of a small, devout Christian sect. For Sandemanians, purity and cleanliness were not just social niceties. They were reflections of spiritual purity. The state of the Thames would have offended him not just as a scientist, but on a deep, moral level. He saw it as a physical manifestation of a kind of societal decay. His letter ends with a powerful plea, a warning that perfectly captures the miasma theory mindset of the time. He asks, if we neglect this subject, we cannot expect to do so with impunity, nor ought we to be surprised if, ere many years are over, a pestilence arise from our midst, which, sweeping away thousands of lives, will rebuke us for our supineness and apathy. He is literally predicting a plague, born from the stench. The debate among historians here centers on the letter's true impact. Did Faraday's letter actually spur any real action at the time? The immediate answer is no. There was a flurry of editorials and cartoons in magazines like Punch Tunes, one of which famously depicted the Thames as a monstrous, skeletal figure of Father Thames introducing his offspring diphtheria, Euler, and cholera to the city. It raised awareness, certainly, but the political will to spend the enormous sums of money required to fix the problem was still absent. The politicians and bureaucrats nodded gravely, agreed that it was all very shocking, and then went on with their business, hoping the problem would somehow solve itself. Faraday's letter was a clear, unignorable shot across the bow. He had used his immense public platform to define the problem in stark, scientific terms. He had laid down a challenge to the powers that be, but his warning went unheeded. The city's inertia was more powerful than even his reason. The system was broken. The science was misunderstood, and the river was getting worse by the day. The city had been warned by its greatest scientist, and it had done nothing. 3 years later, in the summer of 1858, his apocalyptic prediction would feel terrifyingly close to coming true. Now let's set the final piece of the stage. We have the overflowing cesspits, the flushing toilets accelerating the flow of waste, the overwhelmed sewers. Our river turned into a putrid soup, and a population terrified of deadly miasmas. All the ingredients for a catastrophe are in place. The only thing missing is the spark. That spark arrived in June of 1858, in the form of a relentless, suffocating heat wave. The summer of 1858 wasn't just warm, it was exceptionally hot and dry for London, for weeks on end, starting in late May and intensifying through June. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky. Day after day, the temperature soared into the 30 Celsius, the high 80 and 90 Fahrenheit, which was brutally hot for a city with no air conditioning, built of heat-absorbing brick and stone. At night, the city failed to cool down, the trapped heat radiating from the cobblestones and buildings, offering no relief. You can feel the oppressive stillness in the air. There's no breeze. The usual London dampness has been baked away, replaced by a dry, dusty heat that makes every breath feel gritty. People are lethargic, irritable, horses pant in their harnesses, and the city's usual frantic energy slows to a sluggish crawl. This heatwave was a city-wide ordeal in its own right, forcing people to seek any shade they could find and driving up thirst. But its most significant effect was on the river. The sustained heat did terrible things to the River Thames. First, the water level dropped dramatically, with no significant rainfall for weeks. The river's natural flow, which would normally help to dilute the sewage and carry it out to sea, was reduced to a trickle. The river became less of a flowing body and more of a long, stagnant pond. The millions of gallons of raw sewage pouring into it every day were no longer being washed away. They were simply accumulating, stowing in the heat. Second, the heat acted as a gigantic incubator. Imagine the Thames as a massive, open-air petri dish. you have a nutrient-rich broth of human waste, and you apply intense, sustained heat. The result is a population explosion of bacteria. The decomposition process went into hyperdrive. The bacteria feasted on the raw sewage, releasing enormous quantities of hydrogen sulfide and methane gas. The river literally started to ferment. You could see bubbles rising to the surface, popping with a faint hiss and releasing a fresh puff of foul-smelling gas into the already heavy air. The river's temperature rose, making it even less capable of holding dissolved oxygen, killing off the few remaining fish and aquatic plants that might have helped to mitigate the pollution. The ecosystem completely collapsed. The Thames was now, in a very real and biological sense, dying. And as it died, it gave off the smell of its own decay on an industrial scale. A weird, little-known phenomenon occurred during this time. People living near the river reported that their brass doorknobs, silver spoons, and other metal objects were spontaneously turning black. The hydrogen sulfide gas rising from the river was so concentrated that it was chemically reacting with the metals in their homes, tarnishing them overnight. Some people even claimed the fumes were discoloring the paint on their walls. It was as if the river's corruption was physically seeping into the city's buildings. Historians and climate scientists still look back at the weather records of 1858. Was it a freak event? A once-in-a-century heatwave, or was it part of a larger climatic pattern the records espoused by modern standards, relying on handwritten logs and newspaper accounts, making precise analysis difficult? Some researchers suggest it might have been linked to a wider European weather pattern, but the specifics are still a matter of academic inquiry. What is clear, however, is that this specific combination of a prolonged drought and extreme heat, acting upon a river already pushed to its breaking point, was the perfect storm. It was the trigger. The people of London were rapt. The heat drove them to open their windows for any hint of a breeze. But opening the windows meant letting in the ever-worsening stench from the river. It was an impossible choice: suffocate in the heat or suffocate in the smell. Day by day, as the sun beat down and the river stewed, the smell grew. It was no longer a background nuisance you could ignore. It was becoming an active, aggressive presence. It was about to transform from the usual London smell into something else entirely, something that would be given its own name, a name that would go down in history: the Great Stink. The storm was no longer gathering, it was about to break. It's mid-June. Yabba. The heat wave has been relentless for weeks. And then, it happens. The smell hits. It's not a gradual increase anymore. It's as if a switch has been flipped. A so warm wind seems to rise from the sluggish, fermenting river and creep into every corner of the city. This isn't the familiar, localized stench of a bad drain or a pile of rubbish. This is a monolithic, citywide phenomenon, a blanket of olfactory horror. Try to imagine the smell. It's a complex and utterly vile concoction. It has the sharp, eye-watering punch of ammonia mixed with the rotten egg stench of hydrogen sulfide. But underneath that is a deeper, thicker, sweeter smell. This smell of raw, untreated sewage, of human waste, baked and festering in the sun. It's been described in the historical records as a combination of a tannery, a sewer, and a graveyard. It's a physical presence. You feel like you can taste it on the back of your tongue. It coats your clothes, your hair, your furniture. There is no escape. The Great Stink, as the newspapers quickly christened it, was not confined to the riverbanks. It rolled through the grand squares of Belgravia and the squalid alleys of the East End alike. It seeped through keyholes and under doors. It rose up through the floorboards. The city, which had for so long tried to flush its problems away, now found those problems returning as an invisible, gaseous tide. You see people walking through the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. But it's a futile gesture. The smell is too pervasive, too strong. The handkerchiefs themselves start to smell. The city's chemists and apothecaries do a roaring trade. People are buying up anything with a strong scent: camphor, chloride of lime, carbolic acid. They sprinkle it on their floors. sew cloths in it to hang in their windows, and carry it on their person. The result is a buzz or duel of smells, the city's inherent foulness fighting against a desperate, chemical-heavy perfume. You can imagine the air being a weird mix of decay and disinfectant. One of the strangest contemporary accounts of the stink comes from the courts of law located near the river. The legal proceedings were severely disrupted because the stench coming in through the windows was so overpowering that judges, jurors, and lawyers couldn't concentrate. They ordered the windows to be shut. But then the courtrooms, packed with people in heavy wool clothing, became unbearably hot. As a desperate measure, they soaked the heavy curtains of the courtrooms in chloride of lime and hung them back up, hoping they would act as a kind of primitive air filter. It barely worked. Justice itself was being overpowered by the smell. This is where the miasma theory turns from a scientific belief into the engine of mass panic. For the people of London, this wasn't just unpleasant. It was terrifying. They genuinely believed that every breath of this foul air was a gamble with death. They were inhaling what they thought was a pestilence. Parents kept their children indoors, convinced the air outside would kill them. The sales of bogus anti-cholera potions and amulets skyrocketed. Every cough, every stomach cramp, was feared to be the beginning of the end. The city was gripped by a collective anxiety, a fear so palpable you could almost smell it. Or perhaps you could, and it just got lost in the general stink. Historians still debate the exact chemical composition of the Great Stink. While we know the main culprits were hydrogen sulfide and ammonia from decomposing sewage, the specific blend of volatile organic compounds that made it so uniquely offensive is lost to time. Modern science can analyze pollution, but it's hard to retrospectively recreate a smell from 160 years ago based on qualitative descriptions. Was it the sheer concentration? Or was there a particular chemical in the industrial waste also being dumped into the river that gave it its legendary character? It's an unanswerable, and perhaps unappetizing, question. The river itself had become a spectacle of horror. People would gather on the bridges, not to admire the view, but to stare in morbid fascination at the bubbling brand tide below. The newspapers reported that the river was so thick with filth that you could almost see the lumps of sewage floating by. An infamous but possibly apocryphal story claimed the term and rocked his hat into the river from London Bridge. And it didn't sink, but simply rested on the crust of the water's surface. Whether true or not, it captures the public perception. The River Thames, the symbol of Britain's global power and commercial might, had become a national joke and an international embarrassment. The heart of the empire was rotting from the inside out. And now, the whole world could smell it. The crisis had reached its peak. It was no longer a problem for the poor or the unlucky. It was a problem for everyone. And it was about to arrive at the one place where it could no longer be ignored, the front door of Parliament. So what was it like to actually live through this? To get up in the morning and face a day defined by stench. Let's put you in the shoes of an ordinary Londoner. Say, a clerk working in the city. Your day starts not with the smell of coffee or frying bacon, but with the familiar, depressing realization that the stink is still there. It's the first thing you notice upon waking. It seems to have seeped into the very fabric of your mattress. You get dressed, and your clothes, even those kept in a wooden wardrobe, have a faint, foul undertone. You go to the wash basin to splash some water on your face. The water, piped in by one of the private companies, has a slight brownish tint and a distinctively organic taste. You try to drink as little of it as possible, preferring weak tea, hoping the boiling process might kill whatever is in it. It's a gamble you take every single day. Walking to work is an ordeal. The heat is already building, amplifying the smells rising from the street gutters and the gully holes that connect to the sewers. The air is thick enough to chew. Every passing horse-drawn omnibus kicks up a cloud of dust and dried manure. You join the grim-faced crowds, everyone sharing the same miserable experience. The wealthy might be zipping by enclosed carriages, holding scented handkerchiefs to their noses, but you can see from their expressions that even they are not immune. The stink is a great leveler. You pass a pub, and the smell of stale beer and sawdust offers a brief, almost pleasant change of pace before you're plunged back into the main miasma. The doors of shops are all closed, a futile attempt to keep the smell out, which only serves to make them stuffy and hot. Butcher shops are particularly bad. The smell of the meat mingling with the smell of the street in a truly nauseating combination. One of the more peculiar, and little documented, aspects of daily life during the stink was its effect on food. With no refrigeration, food was bought fresh daily from street markets. But the pervasive fumes seemed to make everything go off faster. Milk would sour in a few hours. Bread would pick up the taste of the air. Eating became a hurried, joyless affair, a race against decay. People reported losing their appetites entirely, which, given the belief that the air itself was poison, only added to their health anxieties. When you finally get to your office, a cramped room with several other clerks, the situation is no better. The large windows overlooking the street are clamped shut, despite the stifling heat. The air inside is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, ink, and old paper, all layered on top of the ever-present stench from outside. Your head aches. It's hard to concentrate on the ledgers in front of you. Productivity across the city plummets. Tempers are short. Everyone is on edge. During your lunch break, you don't dare go for a stroll. You might eat a meat pie bought from a street vendor, trying not to think too hard about its ingredients or the hands that made it. You see posters plastered on the walls. Ads for Drive, Moffat Scholar, a resisting pills, or the gentleman's odorless pocket filter. Quackery is thriving in the atmosphere of fear. The only real topic of conversation is the stink. People share stories, rumors. Did you hear about the ferry captain who fainted from the fumes? They say the Queen is considering moving the court to Windsor. The newspapers are full of it, with editorials demanding action and satirical cartoons mocking the government's inaction. There's a sense of shared misery, but also a growing anger. How could the government of the most powerful nation on earth allow its capital city to become uninhabitable? Historians are still piecing together the social fabric of this time. How did the stink affect crime rates, or social gatherings, or religious attendance? It's a field known as sensory history, trying to understand the past not just through what people did, but through what they saw, heard, and smelled. Some argue the Great Stink was a profoundly isolating event, forcing people into their homes. Others suggest it was a communal experience that, by making everyone a victim, helped to break down social barriers and create a unified demand for a solution. It likely did both. As your workday ends, you face the walk home again, back through the same olfactorious old course. You get home, exhausted, not from the work, but from the simple act of breathing. You might have a gin, not for pleasure, but to numb your senses and dull the anxiety. You check on your family, hoping no one has a fever, and you go to bed, closing your eyes against the city, but knowing that the stink will still be there in the morning, waiting for you. It was a miserable, grinding existence. A summer spent in a state of siege, not by an enemy army, but by the ghost of the city's own waste. The Houses of Parliament, the very heart of the British Empire, a sprawling, magnificent Gothic revival palace still partially under construction on the banks of the Thames. This was the epicenter of global power, the place where decisions were made that affected millions from India to Canada. And in the summer of 1858, it had a front row seat to the apocalypse. The stink didn't just drift over to Parliament, it laid siege to it. Imagine you're a member of Parliament, an MP. You are, by definition, a man of wealth and influence. You are used to a certain level of comfort, but as you arrive for the day's session in late June, the moment you step out of your carriage, you are hit by a wall of stench so solid it feels like a physical blow. The Grand Victoria Tower, a symbol of permanence and strength, seems to be rising from a bubbling cesspool. The smell is coming directly off the river, right below your grand terrace. You walk into the hallowed halls of Westminster, but the smell follows you. It permeates the libraries, the committee rooms, the division lobbies. The building was new, a masterpiece designed by Charles Berry and Augustus Pugin, but its brand new ventilation system, ironically, was designed to draw air from the riverside. It was essentially pumping the great stink directly into the lungs of the nation's lawmakers, a catastrophic design flaw. The situation inside the Palace of Westminster becomes utterly unbearable. The records from Hansard, the official report of parliamentary debates, are filled with comical and desperate complaints. One MP stands up and declares that he can't possibly enter the library because the smell is so nauseous. Another complains that the stench is so bad it's a danger to the health of every member in the house. They are not being dramatic. They are genuinely terrified. Steeped as they are in the miasma theory, they believe their workplace is actively trying to kill them. Their first, desperate attempt to fix the problem is almost laughably futile. They order the palace's curtains to be soaked in a solution of chloride of lime, just like the law courts had done. Tons of the stuff are brought in. The idea is to create a chemical barrier against the miasma. For a few hours, the building reeks of chlorine, a sharp, keen smell that almost masks the sewage. But the stink is relentless. It pushes through, and soon the air is a sickening cocktail of decomposing waste and harsh chemicals. It probably made their eyes water even more. A little-known and rather desperate plan was even briefly considered: moving the entire government. There was serious talk of adjourning Parliament and relocating all government business to Oxford or St Albans, abandoning the capital until the crisis passed. This was a shocking admission of defeat. The government of the British Empire, which ruled a quarter of the world's population, was being chased out of its own capital by a bad smell. The idea was ultimately rejected. It would be a national humiliation, but the fact it was even discussed shows the level of panic. This is the crucial turning point in our story. For years, the pollution of the Thames had been a problem primarily for the poor who lived along its banks and drank its water. The wealthy and powerful could ignore it. They drank cleaner water from deeper wells, lived in less polluted parts of town, and could simply leave the city when it got unpleasant. But the Great Stink of 1858 changed the equation. It invaded their sanctuary. It made the problem personal. They couldn't debate trade policy or colonial administration when they were actively gagging on the fumes of their own city's excrement. The historical debate here isn't about whether this happened, but about the motivations of the politicians. Was their sudden urge to act born from a noble sense of public duty, a sudden awakening to the plight of the common citizen, or was it pure self-preservation and convenience? The evidence overwhelmingly suggests the latter. The problem had existed for decades. Cholera had killed tens of thousands, but it took the stink physically preventing the MPs from doing their work in comfort to finally galvanize them into action. As one politician of the time, Benjamin Disraeli, would later comment, the issue had now forced itself upon the senses of the legislature. You couldn't table emotion on the smell was tabling emotion on you. The press, of course, had a field day. The satirical magazine Punch published some of its most famous cartoons, depicting MPs with giant noses, or showing a skeletal Father Thames knocking at the door of Parliament. The newspapers, which had been campaigning for a solution for years, now had the ultimate "I told you so" moment. They gleefully reported on every complaint, every failed attempt to mask the smell. The pressure was mounting from all sides, from the public, from the press, and now, most importantly, from the very air within the halls of power. The government's inaction was no longer sustainable. The stink had achieved what years of reports, petitions, and scientific warnings could not. It had made the problem impossible to ignore. A solution was no longer a matter of if, but how first. The man of the hour was not an engineer or a scientist, but a canny and ambitious politician, Benjamin Disraeli. At this point in 1858, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons in a minority Conservative government. Disraeli was a fascinating character and novelist, a dandy, a brilliant orator, and a master of political theatre. He knew a political opportunity when he smelled one, and the Great Stink was the opportunity of a lifetime. Picture the scene in the House of Commons. It's a sweltering July day. The windows are sealed shut, the chloride-soaked curtains are failing, and the air is a barely breathable soup of stinking chemicals. Tempers are frayed, the government is weak, and the opposition is using the crisis to score political points. The usual business of the day, debates on colonial affairs or obscure tax laws, seems utterly absurd in the face of this immediate physical assault. Disraeli sees his chance. While others are simply complaining or panicking, he decides to act. He understands that the politician who solves the great stink will become a national hero. It's a chance to demonstrate competence, to unite a divided parliament against a common enemy, the smell, and to push through a massive, legacy-defining public works project. On one of those foul-smelling days, Disraeli rises to address the House. He famously bypasses the usual political niceties. He doesn't talk about the problem in abstract terms. He acknowledges the raw, physical reality of their situation. He frames the pollution of the Thames not as a mere sanitation issue, but as a national disgrace, a terror that has stalked like a pestilence. He connects it to the miasma theory that everyone in the room believes in, speaking of the poisonous exhalations that threaten their very lives. He is speaking their language of fear, but channeling it towards a solution. He proposes a bill, not a bill to study the problem, or two from another committee to write another report. Those things have been done to death. He proposes a bill to give a single body the Metropolitan Board of Works sweeping powers and, crucially, a massive amount of money to fix the problem once and for all. He wants to give them the authority to raise a loan of £3 million, an absolutely colossal sum at the time, equivalent to billions today. This money would be raised by levying a special tax on all London households for the next 40 years. This was a bold and politically risky move. Proposing a new tax is never popular. But Disraeli was a master salesman. He presented the bill not as a burden, but as an act of salvation. He argued that the cost of inaction, the constant threat of cholera, the damage to trade and national prestige was far greater than the cost of the proposed sewers. He essentially told Parliament, we can either pay now, or we can pay later with our lives and our reputation. A little-known fact about Disraeli's political maneuvering is how he bypassed the usual bureaucratic inertia. The city's governance was a chaotic mess of different parishes, boards, and corporations, all with their own vested interests. They had been arguing for years about who should be responsible for the sewers and who should pay for them. Disraeli's bill cut through this gordian knot by empowering a single, centralized authority, the Metropolitan Board of Works or MBW, and giving it the power to act without needing the approval of all the squabbling local councils. It was a radical centralization of power, pushed through in a moment of crisis. Historians still debate the purity of Disraeli's motives. Was he a true social reformer, genuinely moved by the plight of Londoners, or was he a supreme political opportunist? The consensus is that he was a bit of both. Disraeli did have a genuine belief in what he called Tory democracy, the idea that the ruling class had a paternalistic duty to improve the lives of the common people. He had written about the two nations of the rich and the poor in his novels. This was a chance to put his philosophy into practice. But at the same time, he was undoubtedly aware of the immense political capital to be gained. He saw that the crisis had created a rare moment of political unity where a grand, ambitious, and expensive plan could actually pass. He tabled his bill, the Thames Purification Bill, and pushed it with incredible speed. He suspended other parliamentary business, insisting on the urgency of the matter. He used the ongoing discomfort of the MPS as a tool, essentially saying, the sooner you pass this, the sooner we can open the windows. The stench that had paralyzed Parliament was now being used as a legislative cattle prod. The man who had been a novelist, crafting fictions, was now crafting one of the most important pieces of urban legislation in history, all thanks to a truly unbearable smell. As the politicians in Westminster were finally being spurred into action, the city outside was teetering on the brink of full-blown social panic. The Great Stink wasn't just a physical discomfort or a health scare, it was an existential crisis for London itself. For the first time, people began to seriously question the viability of their city. Imagine the daily chatter in the taverns, the headlines in the penny dreadfullest, the sermons from the pulpits. The theme is apocalyptic. The Times newspaper, which had been sounding the alarm for years, now ran under its editorials. One famous article declared, "We can colonize the remotest ends of the earth, we can conquer India, but we cannot clean out the River Thames." The sentiment struck a chord. It highlighted the absurd paradox of the Victorian-era nation of immense power and global reach that was proving utterly incompetent at managing its own backyard. This sense of humiliation was potent. London was meant to be the shining example of modern civilization, the metropolis of the world. Visitors and diplomats from across the globe were there, and they were all, quite literally, holding their noses. The national pride was deeply wounded. The stink became a symbol of a deeper sickness, a sign that the city's rapid, unregulated growth had created a monster it could no longer control. The fear of disease was, of course, the primary driver of the panic. With the miasma theory as the undisputed truth, Londoners felt they were living in a poison cloud. Every newspaper carried stories of sudden deaths, fueling the tower, while there wasn't a major cholera outbreak in the summer of 1858 itself. The memory of the devastating epidemics of 1849 and 1854 was fresh in everyone's mind. They were living in constant expectation of the next great plague. It felt inevitable. They believed the great stink was the harbinger of a summer of mass death. This led to a mass exodus of anyone who had the means to leave. The wealthy packed up their families and fled to their country estates or to seaside towns like Brighton. The city's roads were clogged with carriages piled high with luggage. This, in turn, created a secondary economic panic. With the rich gone, the luxury shops of the West End saw their business collapse. Theatres, concert halls, and other places of public entertainment were half empty. The service economy that catered to the upper classes was grinding to a halt. A curious and little documented aspect of the panic was the rise of doomsday theories. Some religious preachers declared the stink a form of divine punishment for the city's sins, its greed, its poverty, its moral corruption. They drew parallels to the plagues of Egypt, casting the polluted Thames as a modern-day alternate to blood. For a deeply religious society, this narrative had a powerful grip, adding a layer of spiritual dread to the physical misery. Then there was the ultimate question, whispered at first, then printed openly in the press: was London finished? Had the city grown too large to be sustained? Serious proposals were floated, not just to move Parliament, but to actively encourage depopulation. Pundits and pamphleteers wrote articles with titles like "The Metropolis and Its Dangers," arguing that London's size was unnatural and inherently unhealthy. They debated whether the imperial capital should be moved to a cleaner, more manageable location. The idea that London, the engine of the industrial world, could simply be abandoned seems incredible to us, but it was a very real topic of discussion in the summer of 1858. The debate among historians here is how close the city actually came to a total breakdown of social order. Were there riots? Was there a revolutionary atmosphere? The answer is generally no. The panic was real, but it was a panic of fear and flight, not of anger and violence. The Victorians, for the most part, still had a deep-seated belief in authority and progress. Their anger was directed at the government's inaction, but they still looked to that same government for the solution. They weren't calling for the system to be overthrown, they were screaming for the system to finally do its job. This public pressure was immense. It was a constant, deafening drumbeat of fear, anger, and humiliation. It created the political atmosphere where a radical, expensive solution was not just possible, but demanded. The MPs sweating in their committee rooms weren't just fleeing their own discomfort, they were responding to a city that was losing faith in its own future. The choice was becoming stark: either fix the river, or risk presiding over the decline of the greatest city on earth. The time for talk was over. The time for engineering had arrived, and the man for the job was already waiting in the wings. With the politicians finally panicked into action and the money theoretically on the table, the question became who could possibly solve a problem of this magnitude. The city didn't just need a plumber, it needed a savior. and he found one in the quiet, unassuming, and utterly brilliant chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, Joseph Bazalgette. If you were to picture a Victorian hero, you might imagine a swashbuckling soldier or a fiery politician. Joseph Bazalgette was none of those things. He was the son of a naval officer, of French Huguenot descent. He trained not in a grand university, but as an apprentice to all and surveyor and engineer, learning the trade from the ground up by working on railway projects during the railway mania of the 1832s and 42s. He was a man of slide rules and technical drawing, of methodical calculation and relentless attention to detail. He was, in short, the perfect man for the job. By 1858, Bazalgette was in his late 30s. He had been the chief engineer for the MBW since its formation a few years earlier. He was not a charismatic public figure, but within the engineering community, he was known for his formidable intellect and immense work ethic. He had already spent years studying the mess of London's sewers. He had seen the problem coming. Long before the Great Stink, he and his team had been quietly drawing up plans, anticipating the day when the city would finally be forced to act. When the crisis hit, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was ready. You can imagine him in his office, surrounded by maps and charts, while the politicians were fanning themselves and complaining. He was calm, focused, and utterly undaunted by the scale of the challenge. The problem was immense: how to drain a city of nearly 3 million people without disrupting it, and how to do it in a way that would last for generations. He wasn't interested in a quick fix, a patch-up job like soaking curtains in line. He wanted a permanent solution. A little-known fact about Bazalgette is that his dedication to sanitation was deeply personal. Just a few years earlier, he had nearly died from a serious illness, likely typhoid or cholera, which he contracted during a period of overwork. He had experienced firsthand the devastating effects of the diseases that plagued London. For him, this wasn't just an abstract engineering problem, it was a battle against the very forces that had almost claimed his own life. This personal experience likely gave him a profound sense of purpose and urgency. His public persona was one of quiet confidence. When called to testify before parliamentary committees, he didn't use the flowery, dramatic language of the politicians. He presented facts, figures, and calculations. He would unroll his enormous, meticulously hand-drawn maps and explain his system with a calm, unshakable logic. In an atmosphere of panic and hysteria, his steady, methodical competence was incredibly reassuring. He convinced them not through passion, but through undeniable engineering sense. The historical debate surrounding Bazalgette often revolves around the question of genius. Was he a lone visionary, a single great man who conceived of this entire system himself, or was he the leader of a brilliant team, the public face of a collective effort? The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. Bazalgette was undoubtedly the driving force and the final authority. The grand vision was his, but he led a dedicated team of draftsmen, surveyors, and engineers at the MBW who worked tirelessly to translate his vision into practical reality. He was a great leader as much as a great designer. He inspired immense loyalty and demanded the highest standards from his staff. He was also a master of materials and scale. Having worked on the railways, he understood how to manage massive, complex construction projects. He knew about brickwork, about the new technology of Portland cement which could harden underwater, and about the power of steam engines. He was able to take the best of Victorian technology and apply it to a problem that had existed since Roman times. So, as Disraeli was pushing the legislation through Parliament, all eyes in the engineering world turned to this one man. He was handed a blank check, a mandate from a terrified city, and a problem of almost unimaginable complexity. It was the kind of challenge that would either make a man's career or break him completely. For Joseph Bazalgette, it was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. The city was holding its breath, waiting to see his plan. So, what was this grand, revolutionary plan that Bazalgette had been quietly perfecting? It was a stroke of genius. Not because it involved some brand new, magical technology, but because it was a brilliantly simple concept applied on an unimaginably massive scale. The plan was called the interceptor system. To understand its brilliance, you have to remember the old system. You have thousands of local sewers, all built at different times by different authorities, with no overall plan. They generally flowed from north to south or south to north on the other side of the river, taking the path of least resistance, following the natural slope of the land, and dumping their contents directly into the Thames at the nearest point. This was the source of the whole problem. Bazalgette's idea was to leave this existing network of local sewers largely in place. It would be impossible to dig them all up and start again. Instead, he would build a new, parallel system of gigantic, gently sloping sewer tunnels running from west to east, right across the paths of the old sewers. These new tunnels were the interceptors. Their job was to catch the sewage from the old sewers before it reached the river. Imagine it like this: think of the old sewers as small streams running down a mountainside towards a lake at the bottom of the Thames. Bazalgette's plan was to dig a massive canal along the side of the mountain that would cut across all those streams, catch their water, and channel it away to a different location far downstream. His full plan was incredibly ambitious. On the north side of the Thames, where the majority of the population lived, he proposed 3 massive interceptor sewers, each at a different level: a high level, a middle level, and a low level sewer. The high and middle level sewers could use gravity, following a very slight, carefully calculated downward slope. But the low level sewer, running closest to the river, was actually below the water level of the Thames. This was a huge problem. How do you make sewage flow uphill? You don't. You use powerful engines. He planned to build massive, ornate pumping stations at key points to lift the sewage from the low-level sewer up into the main outfall sewer that would carry it away. On the south side of the river, he planned a similar, two-level system. All of this collected sewage would then be channeled into 2 enormous outfall sewers, one for the north and one for the south. These wouldn't just dump the sewage anywhere. They would carry it far to the east of London, miles downstream from the city, 2 outfall points at Beckton on the north bank and Cross-Ness on the south. And he wouldn't just release it at any time. The sewage would be held in huge reservoirs and then released on the outgoing tide. So the powerful ebb tide of the Thames would carry it far out into the North Sea, safely away from the city's water intakes. This was a holistic, comprehensive vision. It didn't just solve the problem of sewage in the central city, it solved the problem for the entire metropolitan area and used the natural power of the river itself as part of the solution. It was elegant, powerful, and built to last. One of the lesser known, but brilliant, aspects of his plan was the sheer foresight he applied to the calculations. When his assistants asked him what size the pipe should be, they were planning for a city of 3 million. Bazalgette famously took the most generous population growth estimates he could find, doubled them, and said, "Well, we're only going to do this once and there's always the unforeseen." He ordered them to design the tunnels and pipes to handle the waste of a city of over 6 million people. This decision was seen as extravagant at the time, a huge and unnecessary expense. But it is the single reason why his system continued to function for over 150 years, serving a city that grew far beyond his wildest predictions. Of course, the plan was met with some opposition. This is where our historical debate still exists. Was Bazalgette's plan immediately accepted as the only solution? Not entirely. Other engineers proposed alternative schemes. Some wanted to treat the sewage with chemicals and sell it as fertilizer. Others proposed a network of smaller, competing systems. The Great Stink had unleashed a flurry of engineering ideas. Bazalgette had to defend his plan in front of numerous committees, arguing that the fertilizer schemes were uneconomical and that his unified, gravity and steam-powered system was the most robust and reliable. His calm demeanor and meticulous calculations won the day. He convinced the powers that be that his was the only plan with the scale and vision necessary to truly solve the problem for good. The plan was approved. The sheer audacity of it is still breathtaking. They were going to build over 82 miles, 132 km of massive new bricked Amazon 100 miles long. 800 km of new local street sewers, excavating millions of tons of earth from beneath a living, breathing city, without bringing it to a standstill. It was the largest civil engineering project the world had ever seen. And it all started with a simple, elegant idea: don't fight the old system, just intercept it. Before the first shovel could hit the dirt, there was the thorny issue of the bill, £3 million. In 1858, this was an astronomical sum of money, equivalent to what the entire British government spent on its military in a year. The Great Stink might have created the political will, but the practical question of who would pay, and how, nearly derailed the entire project. Imagine you're a London homeowner. You've just endured a miserable summer of heat and stench. You're terrified of cholera. You desperately want a solution. Then, you read in the newspaper that the proposed fix will involve a new tax, a sewer rate of 3p on the pound of property value tax, added to your bills for the next 40 years. Your relief for the solution is now mixed with a heavy dose of financial anxiety. The debate in Parliament and in the press was fierce. Members of Parliament representing constituencies outside of London argued that this was a local problem and the capital should bear the full cost. Why should a farmer in Yorkshire or a fisherman in Cornwall have their national taxes go towards cleaning up London's mess? It was a fair point. And it ensured that the project would have to be self-funded by Londoners themselves. But even within London, the debate was contentious. The city was not a single entity. It was a patchwork of ancient, wealthy parishes in the city of London proper, and newer, sprawling, and often poorer boroughs surrounding it. The wealthy merchants and bankers of the historic city argued that they already had better than average sewers and shouldn't have to subsidize the sanitation of the poorer outer districts. They fought tooth and nail to be excluded from the new tax or to pay a lower rate. You can picture the heated meetings of the various local boards. A representative from a poor area like Bethnal Green would argue for a uniform tax, pointing out that the river's pollution affected everyone. A representative from a rich parish like St. George's Hanover Square would counter that their residents were already paying high property taxes and shouldn't be punished further. It was a classic battle of rich versus poor, center versus periphery, playing out in the shadow of a public health crisis. One of the curious, behind-the-scenes financial wrangles involved the government's own buildings, the Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace, the various government offices in Whitehall. They were some of the biggest properties in the city. A quiet negotiation had to take place to ensure that the Crown and the government would also pay their fair share of the new sewer rate, something they were not always keen to do. This is where Disraeli's political skill came back into play. He and the supporters of the bill had to frame the cost in a way that seemed manageable and fair. The 40-year term for the loan was a key part of this. By spreading the cost over 2 generations, the annual tax on any individual household would be relatively small. Even if the total sum was huge, it was a kind of buy now, pay later scheme for public health. He argued that they were not just building sewers for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren. It was an investment in the future, a mortgage on a cleaner, healthier city. The debate over the budget is a point where historians still find fascinating details in the archives. The initial £3 million figure was essentially Bazalgette's best guess. But how did he arrive at it? The detailed costings filled volumes, accounting for everything from the price of millions of bricks and barrels of Portland cement to the wages for the thousands of laborers then advised who would have to be hired. There was a significant contingency fund built in, as Bazalgette knew that digging under a city was bound to lead to unexpected problems. Some historians argue that he may have deliberately overestimated the cost likely to ensure he wouldn't have to go back to Parliament and ask for more money, a move that would have been politically disastrous. It was a shrewd calculation, showing he was not just an engineer but also understood the political realities. Ultimately, the sheer terror of the Great Stink was the deciding factor that silenced most of the financial opposition. The cost of the sewers was high, but the perceived cost of another cholera epidemic was higher. The economic damage from the summer's panic, the flight of the wealthy. The disruption to business was fresh in everyone's minds. An investment in public health was now seen as an investment in economic stability. The argument was won. The money was approved. The responsibility for raising it and spending it was handed to Bazalgette's Metropolitan Board of Works. The great project had cleared its final political and financial hurdle. With the plan settled and the money approved, the political machine moved with a speed that is almost unimaginable today. The bill that Benjamin Disraeli had introduced, formally titled the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Act, flew through the legislative process. In the oppressive heat and stench of July 1858, Parliament did something extraordinary. It got things done. The usual, ponderous space of lawmaking was abandoned. The bill was debated, amended, and passed through all its stages in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords in a matter of days. There was no time for filibustering or lengthy procedural delays. The MPs were, to put it bluntly, highly motivated. Every day of delay was another day they had to endure the smell. They wanted to pass the bill and get out of the city for their summer recess. You can almost feel the frantic energy in the committee rooms. Lawyers and clerks working late into the night, finalizing the wording, ensuring the powers granted to the Metropolitan Board of Works were legally ironclad. Messengers would be running back and forth with drafts, the scent of chloride of lime on the paper mingling with the sweat of the overworked staff. The entire machinery of the British state, usually so deliberate and slow, was now running at full throttle. The bill received royal assent from Queen Victoria on August 2nd. From its introduction to its final passage into law, the entire process had taken just 18 days. It stands as one of the fastest and most decisive pieces of major legislation in British history. The Great Stink had achieved in less than 3 weeks what years of royal commissions, scientific reports, and newspaper campaigns had failed to do. This incredible speed highlights a key aspect of the Victorian mindset when they finally decided to do something. They were capable of immense, focused effort. They had a deep-seated belief in their ability to solve problems through engineering, industry, and decisive action. The same society that could conquer continents, unbuild global railway networks could, when pushed, apply that same energy to its own domestic problems. A little-known but crucial part of the Act was a clause that indemnified the Board of Works against legal challenges. The government knew that a project of this scale would inevitably cause disruption. Building massive tunnels under private property was going to lead to lawsuits from landowners claiming damages. The Act essentially gave Bazalgette and his team legal cover to get the job done, preventing the project from being tied up in the courts for years. It was a pragmatic, if somewhat ruthless, piece of lawmaking that prioritized the public good over individual property rights in this specific instance. This leads to a point of ongoing historical discussion. Was this an early example of modern, effective crisis management? Or was it a dangerous subversion of the normal democratic process? Some historians see it as a model of how government should act in an emergency swiftly, decisively, and with a clear goal. They point out that the result was a triumph of public health that saved countless lives. Others are more cautious. They argue that the crisis was used to push through a bill with limited oversight, granting enormous power and money to an unelected body, the MBW. They suggest that while it worked out well in this case, thanks largely to Bazalgette's integrity, it set a potentially dangerous precedent for bypassing scrutiny in the name of urgency. Regardless of the debate, for the people of London in August 1858, it was a moment of profound relief. The news spread quickly. The government was finally acting. A plan was in place. The money was allocated. The city's greatest engineer was in charge. For the first time in months, there was a sense of hope. The stink was still there, of course. The heat had not yet broken. But now, it was a problem with an expiration date. As the MPs packed their bags and fled the city for their holidays, leaving the foul air behind, they left Joseph Bazalgette with the authority, the money, and the monumental task of turning the fastest law in history into the greatest public works project of the age. The talking was over. The digging was about to begin. The fate of London now rested not in the hands of the politicians, but in the hands of the thousands of anonymous workers who would descend into the earth to build a new underworld beneath the city. The ink on the new law is barely dry. The politicians have fled the city. Now, the real work begins, and it belongs to you. You are not an engineer or a politician. You are a novi. The word is a shortened version of navigator, a name given to the men who dug the canals a generation ago. No, it's the title for the hard-as-nails labourers who are the muscle of the Industrial Revolution, and you are the new front line in London's war against filth. Your work begins not with a grand ceremony, but with the simple, brutal act of digging. The primary method you use is called cut and cover. It is exactly what it sounds like. A massive trench, sometimes 40 feet deep and 20 feet wide, is dug along the route of the new sewer. You and hundreds of other men line this trench. Your day is a blur of swinging pickaxes and heaving shovels. The noise is immense, the rhythmic clang of iron on stone, the scrape of shovels against gravel, the shouts of the foreman, and the creak and groan of wooden scaffolding holding back the walls of earth. Above you, the city of London carries on, almost oblivious. You can hear the dull rumble of horse-drawn carriages and omnibuses passing just a few feet over your head, a constant reminder of the world you've left behind through the gloom of the trench. The project's genius lies in its choreography. Major roads are not closed entirely. The work is done in sections. The trench covered with heavy timber planking so that traffic can continue to flow over the top while you toil in the darkness below. The goal is to build a new underground world without paralyzing the world above. Life in the trench is hard and dangerous. You work by the flickering, unsteady light of gas lamps or simple tallow candles, which cast long, dancing shadows on the walls of wet clay. The air is cool and damp, thick with the smell of earth and sweat. The greatest fear is a collapse. The London soil is a treacherous mix of clay, gravel, and sand, and the constant vibration from the traffic above can weaken the timber shoring. You learn to listen to the groans of the wood, to read the signs of stress in the earth. A moment's inattention could be fatal. Then there's the water. You are, after all, digging massive drains. The ground is saturated. You work constantly in mud and water, your boots perpetually soaked. Pumps clatter away day and night, trying to keep the cuttings from flooding. And sometimes, you break into things you wish you hadn't. An old, forgotten plague pit from the 17th century, a Roman burial ground, or most dangerously, a pocket of natural gas trapped in the earth, which could be ignited by your lamps, or a live, overflowing sewer that floods your trench with a sudden, foul deluge. The navvies are a tribe unto themselves, a nomadic army of skilled labourers. You are paid relatively well for the time, but you earn every penny. You are known for your physical strength, your prodigious appetite, and your legendary thirst. After a 10-hour shift of back-breaking labour, you and your comrades flock to the pubs, spending your wages on beer and food, creating a rowdy, temporary community before moving on to the next section of the line. The human cost of this monumental project is a subject of ongoing historical study. Official records on workplace accidents were poor, while Bazalgette was known for his meticulousness. The safety standards of the era were nothing like today's. How many men died or were seriously injured building these tunnels? The exact numbers are lost to history, but the work was undeniably perilous. The debate continues: was this level of risk simply accepted as a normal part of 19th century industrial work? Or could more have been done to protect the men? It's likely a combination of a brutal era's low regard for worker safety and the sheer, unavoidable dangers of the task itself. Once a section of the trench is dug and secured, the bricklayers move in. They are the artists of the operation, working with astonishing speed and precision, laying millions upon millions of bricks with a special mortar made from Portland cement, a new wonder material that hardens even in damp conditions. You watch them work, turning a muddy ditch into a smooth, perfectly cove, incredibly strong tunnel. Then, the trench is filled back in. The road surface is replaced, and the city above forgets you were ever there. But you know that you are laying down a new, hollow brick spine for London, vertebra by vertebra, a hidden masterpiece that will change the city forever. Let's descend once more, this time not into a muddy trench, but into a newly completed section of Bazalgette's sewer system. The work crews have moved on, and for a moment, it's quiet. You're standing inside one of the main interceptor sewers, and it is breathtaking. This is not a simple, utilitarian pipe. It is a work of industrial art, a cathedral of brick. The scale is immense. The tunnel is a perfect circle, or sometimes a distinctive egg shape, easily tall enough for you to stand up and walk around in. Some of the largest conduits are over 11 feet in diameter. The walls are composed of multiple layers of high-quality brick, laid with a precision that would impress a master craftsman. The mortar is perfectly smooth. The acoustics are eerie, a dropped tool would echo for what seems like an eternity down the long, curving corridor. The sheer quality of the workmanship is astounding. This was an era of pride in craft, and Bazalgette demanded the highest standards. He knew these tunnels had to withstand immense pressure from the earth above and the corrosive forces within. There were no shortcuts. Every brick was inspected. The mortar mix, using the new and revolutionary Portland cement, was tested rigorously. The result is a structure of incredible strength and longevity. You can run your hand along the wall and feel the cool, solid smoothness. It feels less like a sewer and more like the vaulted crypt of a great medieval church. This is why Bazalgette's sewers are often called underground cathedrals or cathedrals of effluent. The name captures not just their scale and beauty, but the sense of civic pride and monumental purpose with which they were built. The Victorians weren't just solving a problem, they were building a monument to their own ingenuity and their mastery over the natural world. A fantastic, little-known detail is the aesthetic care that went into the design. Bazalgette and his team didn't just build functional tunnels, they built beautiful ones. The brickwork is often decorative, with different colored bricks used to create patterns. At the junctions where different sewers meet, the brickwork arches and curves in elegant, flowing lines. These were places that, once sealed, almost no one would ever see again. Yet, the engineers and bricklayers took the time and effort to make them beautiful. This speaks volumes about the Victorian ethos, the belief that good design and beauty should be inherent in a creation, even if it's hidden deep underground. This leads to a fascinating debate among architectural and social historians. Why did they lavish such care and expense on the aesthetics of a hidden sewer system? Was it simply the pride of the craftsman? Was it a moral belief that even the most utilitarian structures should have a sense of dignity and order? Or was it a canny political move by Bazalgette? Some argue that by making the sewers so grand and well built, he was demonstrating the value of the huge investment, creating a physical testament to the money being spent. When politicians and journalists were taken on tours of the completed sections, they weren't just shown a pipe, they were shown a work of art, a masterpiece of engineering that justified its enormous cost. You notice the egg shape of the tunnel you're in. This wasn't just for aesthetics, it was a clever piece of engineering. The narrower bottom of the egg shape meant that even when the flow of water was low, it would be concentrated into a smaller channel. This kept the water moving fast enough to carry along solid waste and prevent sediment from building up and causing blockages. At times of heavy rainfall, the wider upper part of the egg could handle the vastly increased volume. It was a self-cleaning design, elegant and brutally effective. Walking through this silent, subterranean world, you can feel the sheer ambition of the project. This is the city's new circulatory system, invisible but essential, above your head. Millions of people are living their lives, completely unaware of the vast, hollow world beneath their feet. They don't know that this brick tunnel is the reason their city is about to become healthier, cleaner, and more livable than ever before. You are standing in the engine room of a revolution made of nothing more than brick, cement, and an extraordinary vision. The interceptor sewers were the arteries of the new system, but they needed a halt, rather, several halts. Gravity could do most of the work for the high and middle-level sewers. But the low-level sewers, running close to the river, were a different story. They were often below the high tide mark, and their contents needed to be lifted up into the main outfall sewers. This required power, and in the Victorian era, power meant one thing: steam. Let's take a trip to one of the new pumping stations Bazalgette's team constructed, like the one at Abbey Mills in East London. As you approach, the first thing you notice is that it doesn't look like an industrial building. It looks like a bizarre, magnificent Byzantine palace that has been dropped into the middle of a London marsh. This is no simple brick shed. It's an explosion of ornate architecture. There are Moorish domes, Gothic windows, and intricate carvings. The central octagonal tower looks like it belongs on a cathedral in Venice or Istanbul. It was so lavish that it was nicknamed the Cathedral of Sewage. You step inside, and the spectacle continues. The interior is just as ornate as the exterior. There are polished granite columns, decorative ironwork on the railings and staircases, and vast, arched windows that flood the space with light. It smells of hot oil, steam, and polished brass. And in the center of it all, dominating the space, are the engines. They are giants, 8 massive beam engines. Behemoths of cast iron, steel, and brass, each one the size of a small house. A massive horizontal beam, weighing many tons, rocks slowly and hypnotically up and down, driven by the immense pressure of steam from the boiler house next door. One end of the beam is connected to a huge flywheel, the other to a massive piston that plunges down into the depths of the building. Where the pumps are located, the sound is a rhythmic, thunderous symphony, the deep sigh of steam entering the cylinders, the powerful thump of the piston at the end of its stroke, the gentle hiss of the valves. It's the sound of immense, controlled power. These engines were the pinnacle of Victorian mechanical engineering. They were not just powerful, they were built to be beautiful. The cast iron columns supporting them are fluted like Greek pillars. The brasswork is polished to a mirror shine. The engineers who ran the station treated these machines with a reverence usually reserved for living things, constantly oiling, cleaning, and tuning them. A lesser known, key detail for the engineering fans is the sheer efficiency of these engines for their time. They were compound beam engines, meaning they used the steam twice, once at high pressure in a smaller cylinder, and then the exhaust steam was channeled to a larger, low-pressure cylinder to squeeze every last bit of energy out of it. This made them remarkably fuel-efficient, a crucial factor when you're burning hundreds of tons of coal to lift millions of gallons of sewage every single day. Why on earth did they make a sewage pumping station so beautiful? This is another point of vigorous debate among historians, similar to the one about the sewer tunnels themselves. The practical answer is that the Victorians believed good architecture inspired good work. A grand building would instill a sense of pride and responsibility in the men who worked there. The more cynical view is that it was pure public relations. The pumping stations were the only highly visible parts of the new sewer system. Bazalgette and the MBW needed to show the taxpayers what their £3 million had bought them. By creating these stunning temples of steam, they were making an undeniable public statement about the importance and grandeur of the project. It was a way of celebrating the engineering that was saving the city. You watched, mesmerized, as these great machines perform their Herculean task. With each slow, deliberate cycle, they lift over 100,000 gallons of London's waste up from the low-level sewer and into the main northern outfall sewer, which then begins its long, gravity-powered journey eastward, out of the city. This is the hidden power of London, the steam-driven heart that makes the whole system work. It is the perfect embodiment of the Victorian era's spirit, a fusion of classical beauty, industrial might, and audacious problem-solving. It's a style some have called steampunk, long before the term was ever invented, a world where massive, powerful machinery is also a work of high art. The journey for London's waste isn't over yet. It has been lifted by the magnificent steam engines and pushed into the final leg of its subterranean voyage, the Great Northern and Southern Outfall Sewers. You follow its path, walking on the ground above one of these colossal brick conduits. This is the grand trunk road of the entire system. It's a massive tunnel, in some places built up on an embankment that strides across the marshy landscape of East London like a Roman aqueduct. Your destination is one of the two outfall points across Ness on the south bank or Beckton on the north. Let's say you're across Ness, right next to the beautiful pumping station. The sewage doesn't just flow straight into the river. If it did, the problem would only be moved, not solved, on an incoming tide. All that filth would just be washed straight back up the river into the heart of London, and you'd be back where you started. Bazalgette knew this, and his solution to this final problem is arguably the most brilliant part of his entire design. He built in enormous reservoirs. You stand at the edge of one, and it is a staggering sight. It's a man-made lake, covering several acres, containing the raw, untreated sewage from half of London. For 12 hours, the collected waste of millions of people is held here. A vast, stagnant, burnt pond. The smell is, well, exactly what you'd expect. But it's contained, far from the city centre. This is where Bazalgette plays his ace, the move that elevates his system from great to genius. He decided to harness the power of the Thames itself. The river is tidal, with 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. The flow of water is immense. He planned to use the outgoing tide, the ebb tide, as a free, natural flushing mechanism. So, you wait. The tide in the river turns. The high water mark is reached. And slowly, the powerful current begins to reverse, flowing eastward, out towards the sea. But the sluice gates of the reservoir remain shut. They don't open them at the first sign of the turning tide. This is where the precision comes in. Here's a little-known detail that shows the depth of their planning. The operators in the gatehouse, working from tidal charts and direct observation, would wait. They would hold the sewage back until about 2 hours after high tide. Why? Because this is the point at which the ebb tide is running at its fastest and most powerful. They had a window of just a few hours to work with. Then, and only then, would the signal be given. With a grinding of gears and a turning of massive iron wheels, the giant sluice gates are opened, and the reservoir is unleashed. A roaring, brown torrent, millions upon millions of gallons of sewage, thunders down a massive channel and out into the river. The force is incredible. It's a man-made flood, precisely timed to merge with the most powerful phase of the natural river flow. The sheer momentum of the ebb tide catches the effluent and carries it, at speed, far downstream, miles out into the vast expanse of the Thames estuary and ultimately, the North Sea. By the time the tide turns again to flow back towards London, the waste from the previous cycle is long gone. It was a simple, elegant, and brutally effective system. Now, this is where modern environmental historians have a complicated conversation. Was Bazalgette's solution perfect for 19th century London? Yes, it saved the city, but it came at a cost. Bazalgette's system did not treat the sewage, it just relocated it. Nutrient-rich effluent was being dumped into the estuary. Over the years, this led to the creation of huge, foul-smelling sludge banks near the outfalls. It changed the ecology of the estuary, killing off fish populations and creating what was known as the sewage zone. In solving London's sting, he had inadvertently created a new zone of pollution further downstream. The debate continues, should he have foreseen this given the scientific knowledge of the day, which lacked any deep understanding of ecology? It's highly unlikely. He was tasked with solving one specific, deadly problem, and he did it brilliantly. The long-term environmental impact was a problem for a future generation to solve. But standing there, watching the river do the work for free, you could only marvel at the ingenuity. Bazalgette had taken the city's greatest problem and used the city's greatest natural feature to solve it. It was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. The system was complete. It was a symphony of gravity, steam, and tides, all working in concert to bring health and cleanliness back to the world's greatest city. The construction of the new sewer system wasn't a single event. It was a phased, decade-long process. The major interceptor sewers and pumping stations were built between 1859 and 1865, with extensions and connections continuing for another 10 years. But you didn't have to wait for the entire project to be finished to feel the effects. The change was almost immediate. Let's go back to the heart of London, to the summer of 1866. The new high-end middle-level sewers on the North Bank are operational. They are already intercepting the waste from a huge portion of the city's old sewers. It's another hot summer. The kind of weather that just a few years earlier would have triggered another great stink. But this year, something is different. Something is missing. You stand on London Bridge, looking down at the Thames. The water is still far from pristine, but it's noticeably better. The thick, brown, soupy consistency is gone. The greasy, iridescent film is much reduced. You can still see refuse, but the overwhelming, solid presence of raw sewage has vanished. You take a breath. The air is just air. It smells of the city, of coal smoke and horses, but the monstrous, all-pervading stench of the river is gone. It's a miracle of subtraction. The relief in the city is palpable. People can open their windows in the summer without being assaulted. The practice of carrying a scented handkerchief becomes a quaint memory rather than a daily necessity. The newspapers, which had been so full of doom and gloom, now run articles filled with civic pride and wonder. They praise Bazalgette and the Metropolitan Board of Works, calling the new system the most extensive and wonderful work of modern times. You can see the change in people's behavior. They are starting to use the river for leisure again. Pleasure steamers, which had seen their business collapse during the stink, are now packed with Londoners enjoying a trip down the river without having to hold their noses. For the first time in a generation, a trip on the Thames is a pleasant experience. One of the more charming, little-known celebrations of this newfound freshness came from the workers themselves. After a particularly difficult section of the sewer was completed, Bazalgette hosted a formal dinner for the project's backers and engineers. The venue inside the newly completed sewer tunnel itself, before it was commissioned, imagine that seeing long tables with white tablecloths and fine china, set up inside a massive, clean brick sewer. The gentlemen in their top hats and frock coats toasting the success of the project in the very structure they had built. It was a uniquely Victorian way to celebrate, a testament to their pride in their creation. The immediate improvement of the air quality had a profound psychological impact. The fear of the miasma, which had so gripped the city, began to recede. People felt safer. London felt less like a death trap and more like a home. The property values of houses and businesses along the river, which had plummeted, began to recover and then to soar. But did everyone praise the new system? Not quite. This is a point of historical nuance. While the majority were thrilled, there were some unforeseen consequences and complaints. In the early days, before the system was perfectly balanced, the rapid flushing of the old sewers sometimes caused unexpected problems. The fast-moving water could dislodge decades of accumulated filth and grime in the local pipes all at once, leading to temporary blockages or, ironically, a sudden burst of foul-smelling gas from a street-level gully hole. Some residents initially complained that the new system was making the smell worse in their immediate vicinity. These were teething problems, quickly resolved, but they show that even a successful revolution has its minor glitches. The overwhelming feeling, however, was one of triumph. The city had faced an existential threat and had engineered its way out of it. The great stink was over. The air was clear. London had been brought to its knees by its own filth, and it had risen again, keener and more confident than ever. It was a victory not of armies or navies, but of bricks, mortar, steam, and human ingenuity. The most obvious and terrifying symptom of London's sickness had been cured. But the greatest benefit of Bazalgette's system was yet to be discovered. It was a silent, invisible victory that would save more lives than anyone could have possibly imagined. With the stink gone and the air breathable, another, slower, and more beautiful change began to take place. The The River Thames, which had been declared biologically dead, began to show faint signs of life. The rebirth of the river was a gradual process, a quiet epilogue to the dramatic engineering story. For decades, the only things that could survive in the central London Thames were certain types of hardy bacterium to perfect worms, creatures that thrive in low oxygen, highly polluted environments. Fish were a distant memory. Any fish that strayed too far upriver from the cleaner waters of the estuary would quickly suffocate and die. The image of a living, breathing river ecosystem in the heart of the city was a fantasy. But as Bazalgette's interceptor sewers began to capture the daily deluge of waste, the river's chemistry started to change. With the source of the pollution cut off, the natural cleansing processes of the river could finally begin to work. The slow but constant flow of fresh water coming down from the upper Thames began to dilute the remaining pollution. The tides, no longer bringing sewage back into the city, now helped to flush the river clean twice a day. Oxygen levels in the water, which had been near zero, slowly started to creep upwards. You wouldn't have noticed the change overnight, but by the late 1860s and early 1870s, people started to see things they hadn't seen in their lifetimes. Small, silvery fish-like smelts and eels were spotted near the bridges in central London. These were the pioneers, the first signs that the water was becoming habitable again. The return of the fish was a source of great public excitement. Newspapers would report on catches, almost as if they were dispatches from a newly discovered country. Imagine an old fisherman, who had long given up on the urban Thames, tentatively putting a line in the water off a pier and feeling a tug. The news would have spread like wildfire. The Thames was alive again. Here's a wonderful, little-known fact that illustrates this recovery. In 1874, just 9 years after the main sewer system was open, a survey was conducted on the biodiversity of the river. The findings were remarkable. They found not just eels, but also flounder, dace, and even whitebait, a type of small, young fish that is highly sensitive to pollution. The presence of whitebait was considered the ultimate proof that the river was healing. It was the biological seal of approval on Bazalgette's work. Of course, the river was still a long way from being a pristine, natural waterway. It was a hard-working, industrial river, with heavy boat traffic, docks, and factories lining its banks. It was still murky with silt and runoff from the streets. The recovery was not, and could not be, complete, but the fundamental sickness, the overwhelming sewage pollution, had been cured. This is where ecologists and historians still explore the data. How quickly did the ecosystem bounce back? Which species returned first? The recovery was not a simple linear process. It was subject to setbacks, like industrial spills or unusual weather patterns. Some historians argue that the public perception of the recovery was perhaps more rosy than the scientific reality. They point out that while some fish returned, the overall biodiversity was still a shadow of what it had been a century earlier. The river was less dead rather than fully alive. It's a debate about baselines. What does a healthy urban river truly look like? But for the people of London, these nuances didn't matter. What mattered was what they could see. They saw a river that no longer stank, a river where you could see fish jumping. It was a powerful symbol of urban renewal. The city hadn't just built a sewer, it had resurrected its own river. This visible, natural recovery was the poetic conclusion to the engineering epic. It proved that the relationship between a great city and its river didn't have to be a destructive one. It was possible to build and grow without killing the very environment that gave the city life. The return of the fish was the river's own thank you note to Joseph Bazalgette. The most profound legacy of Bazalgette's new sewer system was one that nobody at the time fully anticipated. It wasn't the clean air or the returning fish, as wonderful as those were. The greatest victory was the one that happened silently, invisibly, in the water pipes and wells of the city. The new sewers became the accidental conquerors of London's deadliest scourge, cholera. Remember Dr. John Snow and his lonely, ignored theory about the Broad Street pump? Back in 1854 he had argued that cholera was a waterborne disease, spread by consuming water contaminated with the waste of infected people. The medical establishment, clinging to their miasma theory, had dismissed him. They believed the great stink was the harbinger of a new plague because the smell itself was the poison. In 1866, their theory was put to the ultimate test. A cholera outbreak struck London again. But this time, something was different. The outbreak was almost entirely confined to a specific area in the East End of London. It was a terrible, localized tragedy, with thousands dying in a few small parishes. But it didn't spread. The rest of London, the vast areas now served by Bazalgette's new sewers, remained almost entirely untouched. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected around the disease. This strange pattern demanded an explanation. Why did the cholera stop at the edge of the East End government inquiry, led by a man named William Farr, who had previously been a staunch supporter of the miasma theory, investigated the outbreak, and they found the smoking gun. The afflicted area was one of the few parts of London that Bazalgette's new sewer system had not yet reached. More importantly, the residents of this area got their drinking water from a local reservoir, supplied by the East London Water Company, and it was discovered that this reservoir had been contaminated by a nearby, leaky sewer that still emptied into the River Lee, a tributary of the Thames from which the water company drew its supply. The evidence was undeniable. The only people getting sick were the ones drinking the contaminated water. The rest of London, which was now indirectly protected because the main river was no longer accessible, stayed healthy. John Snow, who had tragically died in 1858 without ever seeing his theory widely accepted, was finally, posthumously, proven right. The 1866 outbreak was the last major cholera epidemic in London's history. This is a point of major historical significance. Bazalgette had built his sewers to fight the miasma to get rid of the smell. He was operating under the same wrong scientific theory as everyone else, but in doing so, he had accidentally solved the real problem. By preventing the sewage from contaminating the drinking water sources in the Thames, he had broken the cycle of cholera transmission. It was one of the most magnificent and impactful mistakes in the history of public health. He had aimed at the wrong target but hit the bullseye by accident. A fascinating, little-known detail of this story is the slow, grudging conversion of the scientific community. William Shaw, the man leading the 1866 inquiry, had been one of Snow's most prominent critics. You can read his reports and see his thinking evolve as he confronts the overwhelming evidence. He doesn't renounce the miasma theory overnight, but he is forced to concede that the water factor is undeniable. It was a huge, humbling moment for Victorian science, a paradigm shift forced by the stark, unavoidable facts on the ground. The academic debate here is a subtle one. Did the 1866 epidemic single-handedly kill the miasma theory? No, not entirely. Old ideas die hard. The belief that bad air caused other diseases lingered for decades more. But it was the mortal blow. It convinced the key policymakers and engineers that clean water was the absolute, non-negotiable key to preventing epidemic disease. It fundamentally changed the priorities of public health. Not just in London but around the world. Cities from Paris to Boston to Hamburg looked at what had happened in London and began to plan their own modern water and sewer systems. Bazalgette's project became the blueprint for the modern city. It had set out to solve a smell and ended up saving tens of thousands of lives from a disease it wasn't even targeting. This accidental triumph is perhaps the most impressive part of the entire story. It's a testament to the idea that good, robust infrastructure can have benefits far beyond its original purpose, protecting and improving lives we might not even predict. The politicians who debated in the stinking halls of Parliament are now just names in history books. The editorials that thundered with outrage have yellowed in archives. But the work of Joseph Bazalgette endures. His legacy is not carved in stone on a public square, but laid in brick and iron deep beneath the streets. It is a living, working legacy that serves London to this very day. This is, without exaggeration, the most incredible part of the story. The core of the sewer system that you could walk through in 1870 is still the backbone of London's sanitation system in the 21st century. Those main interceptor sewers, those grand brick tunnels, are still there, still doing the job they were designed for over 150 years ago. When you flush a toilet in many parts of London today, you are still using Joseph Bazalgette's system. It is a silent, faithful servant to a city that has transformed almost beyond recognition around it. The secret to this incredible longevity lies in that famous decision he made in his office, surrounded by his draftsmen, where he took the most generous population estimates and doubled them. He was doing more than just being cautious. He was future-proofing his creation on a scale that was almost absurd at the time. His contemporaries thought he was being extravagant, wasting public money on tunnels that were far too large. But history has proven him to be a visionary. His extravagant sewers allowed London to grow, to absorb the population booms of the 20th century, and to become the sprawling megacity of over 9 million people it is today, all without having to rip up the entire system and start again. For his monumental achievement, Joseph Bazalgette was rightly honored, though in a manner that suited his quiet, professional character. He wasn't given a grand dukedom. In 1875, upon the completion of the project's main phase, Queen Victoria knighted him. He became Sir Joseph Bazalgette. One little-known detail speaks volumes about his character. It's said that he was later offered a baronet's eye, a hereditary title that his sons could have inherited, but he politely declined it. He was a man of work, not a dynasty. His true legacy wasn't a title, but the 318 million bricks and 880 cubic yards of concrete that he had masterfully marshaled into a system that saved his city. This enduring success, however, is the subject of a sophisticated modern debate among urban planners and historians. Did the very perfection of Bazalgette's system create a legacy? The argument is that his solution was so good, so robust, that it engendered a century of complacency. London got so used to its Victorian sewers working flawlessly that it failed to invest and innovate for the future. His system was designed for a city of 4 to 6 million. It is now straining under the pressure of more than 9 million. This is precisely why, in our own time, London has had to undertake a new, even bigger project, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, or super sewer, to finally upgrade and supplement Bazalgette's original work. In a strange way, the greatest testament to Bazalgette's success is that it took 150 years for his system to finally be overwhelmed. His influence, however, extends far beyond the banks of the Thames. The London sewer system became the template, the gold standard for sanitary engineering across the globe. Cities everywhere, facing their own crises of industrial air pollution and disease, sent their engineers to London to study what Bazalgette had done. The principles of interceptor sewers, of separating sewage from drinking water, and of building for the future became the fundamental tenets of modern urban planning. His work didn't just clean one city, it provided the blueprint for how all modern cities could survive and thrive. He built a silent, underground monument that allowed the modern metropolis itself to be possible. And so, for our final chapter, let's bring you back to the surface. The great project is complete. The city is saved, and you are taking a walk. You are strolling along the Victoria Embankment, on the north bank of the Thames. It's a bright, breezy afternoon. The sun glints off the water. The air is fresh. It is, in every sense, a beautiful day. This wide, elegant boulevard you're walking on, with its granite retaining walls, its ornate benches, and its rows of plane trees, did not exist before Bazalgette. This very land you are standing on was once a foul, sloping mud bank, exposed at low tide, scavenged by to shears and lapped by a river of sewage. The creation of the embankment was the final, public-facing triumph of the entire sewer project. As you walk, you see the grand buildings of London on one side and the flowing river on the other. But the true genius of this place is what's happening right beneath your feet. The embankment is not just a road or a park. It is a hollow, multi-layered piece of infrastructure, built into its very foundations, hidden deep inside the massive granite walls, is the hero of our story, the low-level interceptor sewer. By reclaiming land from the river, Bazalgette not only gained the space for his vital sewer, but also for a new underground railway line, the District Line, which still runs there today, and various utility conduits. The beautiful public space you're enjoying is, in essence, the decorative lid on a box of brilliant engineering. It was a masterstroke of urban planning. It tidied up the messy, chaotic riverfront, gave London a magnificent new public space for recreation, eased traffic with a new road, and, most importantly, provided the essential route for the sewer that was saving the city. It turned a symbol of London's shame, the filthy riverbank, into a symbol of its pride. Here's a wonderfully strange, little-known detail about its construction. The project involved moving enormous amounts of earth and materials. To help with this, the construction company bought the camels, of all things, from a traveling circus. It was believed their wide, soft feet would be better suited to the marshy, muddy conditions of the worksite than the hooves of horses, so for a time, Londoners were treated to the bizarre sight of camels hauling carts of dirt and stone along the future site of the embankment. It's a surreal image that captures the strange, improvisational spirit of Victorian engineering. As you continue your walk, you pass a bronze statue, set back from the road. He's a thoughtful-looking man, seated, gazing out over the river he tamed. It's Sir Joseph Bazalgette. It's a modest monument for a man whose work transformed the city. His real monument is all around you: the clean air, the living river, and the very ground you're standing on. However, the creation of the embankment is a subject of historical debate regarding its social impact. While it was a triumph of engineering and public health, it also swept away a whole world that had existed on the river's edge. The shops, the bars, the pubs, and the homes of the poor communities of fishermen, ferrymen, and laborers who lived and worked on the riverfront were all demolished to make way for this grand new boulevard. Historians argue about the human cost of this improvement. Was it a necessary act of slum clearance that ultimately benefited everyone? Or was it a form of social cleansing, replacing the chaotic world of the working-class riverfront with a sanitized, orderly space for the middle and upper classes to enjoy? It's a reminder that even the most celebrated acts of progress can have complex and sometimes painful consequences. But today, you just feel the peace. The river flows cleanly. A pleasure boat glides by, its passengers smiling and waving. The great stink is a ghost, a story. You have journeyed through the filth and fear of 1858, and you have emerged here, on this beautiful promenade, a testament to a city that, when faced with an existential crisis, chose not to flee, but to build. And now, the journey is over. The great machines and their cathedrals of steam have done their work, their rhythmic breathing fading into a gentle hum. The story of the stink, of the panic, of the bricks and the blueprints, begins to soften at the edges, dissolving like a piece of white card in the murky water of a memory. The sharp details of the past blur into the soft glow of the gas lights you can see reflected on the river's surface. A gentle shimmer on the dark, quiet water. Your steps along the embankment have slowed, the sound of your feet on the paving stones becoming a soft, rhythmic murmur that blends with the whisper of the wind in the plane trees. The city itself seems to be breathing more slowly now, its frantic, daytime energy giving way to a deep, sombering peace. The echoes of history are no longer shouts of crisis, but gentle whispers carried on the tide, telling a story that is already drifting away, becoming part of the great, silent flow of time. Let the image of the river guide you now. See it flowing silently, powerfully, carrying away the last fragments of the day, moving steadily and calmly out towards a vast, quiet sea. There is nothing left to build, nothing left to fight. The work is done, the city is quiet, the story is told, and you can feel yourself drifting with that current, letting go of the shore, floating gently into the soft, deep darkness of a peaceful sleep. the river flows on, and you can rest. The end of the article. Good night.